Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight and joining us over Zoom. So, tonight's presentation is called Economic Recession and Unrest. This is part of a series that our speaker, Dr. Jim Gibb, is doing about the creation of the U.S. Constitution. And tonight's talk is about economic and political unrest in late 18th century America, as well as the formation of political parties. I wanted to take a minute real quick to introduce myself. My name is Allison, and I work for the St. Mary's County Library System. Tonight's guest speaker is Dr. Jim Gibb. Jim, would you be able to talk a little bit about yourself, like give a little bio, talk about your background, just in case there are any new folks joining us?
Sure. I've been doing archaeology for 50 years now. Uh, so I'm an archaeologist, not an historian. Although as an archaeologist, you have to know a little bit about the past. Uh, I've earned my bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees all from the State University of New York system. And I had a public school education, proud of both. I work with the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, which is a unit of the Smithsonian Institution. And it's through them I basically present this series and through the county library system. Thank you very much, Allison.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Jim.
Okay, so let me share screen. Come on there. There we go. I've been doing this with this series. This is the third in what was going to be a series of six talks, but now looks like it might be more like eight or nine because there's too much to cover. But I like to begin with a period quote, and this one from John Adams. You may have heard of him. Nip the shoots of arbitrary power in the bud is the only maxim which can ever preserve the liberties of any people. Words to
Mm,
live by.
yeah.
Okay, so yes, economic recession and unrest. Uh, this is an important subject because this was provide a major impetus for basically chucking the Articles of Confederation and creating and eventually ratifying our U.S. Constitution. And so that's what I'm going to focus on. Towards the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about the formation of political parties, which is something that surprisingly, uh, the founders, the framers of the Constitution did not anticipate. And it's a little odd because these parties were forming before the Constitution was written. And that focus will be on Maryland. We'll get to it eventually. So there are a number of basically mob actions that started as early as 1783. It's referred to as the Pennsylvania or Philadelphia Mutiny. June 20th, 1783, the Treaty of Paris wasn't signed till several months later. So technically, we were still at war. But in this so-called mutiny, a bunch of Continental Army soldiers, Pennsylvania soldiers, demanded back pay for their service. And the way they did this is they converged on Philadelphia and they went up to Independence Hall and barred the doors and told Congress, which met on the first floor of Independence Hall, we're not letting you out until we get paid. So there was a negotiation, and Alexander Hamilton was a principal in this negotiation. Um, he eventually became Secretary of the Treasury, but at the time he was one of George Washington's right-hand men. So he promised them that they would deal with it. Uh, they then, Hamilton and a couple of other members of the Continental Confederation Congress went upstairs to the second floor of Independence Hall, which is where the state government for Pennsylvania met. And they approached the executive council for Pennsylvania, said, will you, for the love of God, get us some troops here, break up this mutiny? And the answer they got back from the kind of head of that council, John Dickinson, was that no, we're not going to do that. And part of the reason, part of his reasoning was that we could bring in militia to try to stop this mutiny, but chances are they'll end up siding with the mutineers and we'll just have a bigger problem. So Congress was basically defenseless. And so what they did was they slipped away and they went to Princeton and set up the Confederation Congress in Princeton, at least temporarily before moving down to Annapolis. Annapolis was essentially, I would say, the capital of this country. It was more sort of the NATO headquarters, if you will, for the Confederation states. Remember, at this point, we're under the Articles of Confederation. There is no national government because there is no nation. There are 13 nations, and they've come together as a group with basically ambassadors negotiating amongst themselves. So there's no national government. There's no way for them to protect themselves. However, Congress writes to George Washington, and if you've been watching the Ken Burns series, there is a bit there about in summer of 1783, George Washington has most of his troops up at Newburgh, New York, on the Hudson River, basically protecting uh, the center of the country from any British invasions out of Canada. And he has a small army. You know, most of the guys have left. We hadn't had conflict since Yorktown in 1781. So he gets this message and he sends 1,500 troops down to uh, put it to quell the rebellion in Philadelphia. So ramifications of that mutiny is, first of all, is a breakdown of military discipline. And there's a reason for it. Congress wasn't paying the army. Again, if you've been watching the Ken Burns series, he talks about that quite a bit. Um, Washington is very embarrassed because these are his troops. They have mutinied. And for him, it's kind of a stain on him and on his reputation. But more importantly than his reputation is that exposed an important weakness in the Articles of Confederation. The Confederation Congress really didn't have control over its troops, and it only would have control during wartime. Because again, this isn't a national government, this isn't a national army per se. The Confederation Congress did not have the power to impose taxes. They had no way of generating revenue other than requisitioning money, material, and troops from each of the 13 individual states. So this is a major flaw and did not bode well for the security of whatever would happen after the revolution. Interesting also, one of the other ramifications is that Congress people have pretty good memories, believe it or not. And so when they were writing the Constitution, they were really concerned about the future of Congress and about how the national government would protect itself if it had to rely on a particular state to muster troops. And that's where the federal district came from. The District of Columbia harkens back to this mutiny in June 1783. Um, so, I'm trouble seeing some of this. Oops. So we get this post-war economic depression after the war. The Treaty of Paris is signed. You know, lots of Americans are jubilant, um, but we're looking at significant economic problems. Number one, the British government is not allowing us to trade with their colonies in the West Indies, and that was a major source of revenue for us. Shipping food down to the sugar colonies, they down there, they're busy producing sugar, not food to feed themselves. So a lot of livestock and grains were shipped out of eastern seaboard ports down to the West Indies, but the British kept us out of that. They were also forcing us out of the fishing grounds off Newfoundland, another source of income for the northern colonies and New England colonies, and also it impeded the flow of sugar from the West Indies up to the New England colonies where they would turn it into, rum. And a lot of that sugar also came into the Chesapeake area, particularly Alexandria. So those restrictions made hard economic times. After the Treaty of Paris, people were still responsible for the debts that they had incurred prior to the revolution. So you have all these merchants and landowners back in Britain were saying, well, we want back rents and we want the debts you owe us. And oh, by the way, we don't want it in tobacco. We don't want it in rice or wheat. We want it in specie, that is, cash money. At the same time, the states had all these debts from the war that they had to pay off. And so they increased taxes. And like the creditors back in Europe, the states were insisting that people pay in cash money, not products, not tobacco, for instance. We have Henry Harford, the son of the last Lord Baltimore, an illegitimate son, so he wasn't. He did the baronetcy did not convey down to him, but the property did. So he was in Maryland trying to collect these debts, largely unsuccessful. Farmers, particularly, I mean, we're a farming nation. Like 95% of the population was involved in agriculture one way or another. But the farmers were demanding protection against foreclosure because they couldn't pay these taxes and these debts. And so debt creditors would go to the courts and foreclose on these farms. These farmers, many of whom who fought for the American cause, were losing their farms. So they're fighting taxes, they're fighting debt. They petitioned their various state governments. Uh, But in many cases, most cases, those petitions failed. And so armed groups of men, this is not a single entity across the 13 states, or even within a particular state, we'd have a number of groups independently getting together with firearms and going to the courthouses and intimidating creditors to withdraw their suits, intimidating judges, basically closing down the courts. And as I'll go into in a few minutes, that was happening up and down the Eastern Seaboard, including in Maryland. The state governments, you know, how did they respond? Well, they got their state militias and used armed state militias to quell these riots. So we've got, say, militia in Massachusetts going up against Massachusetts farmers who are trying to protect their property. Not really a good way to start a country. All of this is what helped drive Washington out of retirement. He was perfectly happy staying down in Mount Vernon. Uh, he'd done his bit. He was very concerned about his reputation, didn't want to get involved with things that were going to soil that reputation. The various states, prior to the Constitution, would mint their own coins, and that helped a little bit. But these coins are base metal. They're made of largely copper. And so they have no intrinsic value. You can't take a handful of copper coins and melt them down and expect to get any value out of it. It was just copper. The kind of coins people wanted, and they wanted in paying debts and taxes, were gold and silver coins because those have intrinsic value. They're not based on the full faith and whatever of a particular government. The farmers were actually demanding paper money. And again, if you've watched the Ken Burns series, he did talk a little bit about paper money.
Ken Burns.
Samuel Adams accused the British of instigating these riots. Whether they did or not, I don't know. They probably a little bit. The British were really bent out of shape about losing their American colonies, even though it was, I think, largely their fault. But they were really humiliated by it. And so they continued to poke and prod. They kept their troops in the Ohio River Valley despite the treaty. And they were just kind of being nasty. So they may have had some part in it, but mostly,
The American
um,
Revolution.
yeah, we may need to mute probably Linda's phone because we got background noise there. Uh,
Sorry.
but Sam Adams was a principal behind, demanding that, we have a riot act, that we suspend habeas corpus, that would be able to arrest these people without formal charges and hold them. And this quote I have here from him, in monarchy, the crime of treason may admit of being pardoned or lightly punished, but the man who dares rebel against the laws of a republic ought to suffer death. A bit extreme, but he was an extreme kind of guy. And we see echoes of that even in the news today. You know, somebody speaks against or acts against the establishment, well, they must be put to death. So we have uprisings in Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Maryland, South Carolina, probably all of the states. The best known is called Shays Rebellion. And I've been going back and forth on this a little bit, or did, with Ray Sarnacki, who's on this call. He found a paper, which, or maybe I found, one of us found this paper. It's kind of interesting where the historian is looking at Shays Rebellion in Western Massachusetts and saying that, yeah, the establishment was painting this one Revolutionary War veteran as a demagogue, and that he's the cause of all the problems. But as we will see, he is not. We have this engraving here, colorized, and it represents a brawl between a supporter of the Massachusetts government and one of the rebels in Shays Rebellion. I'm pretty sure that this does date to Shays Rebellion, and one of the few errors I saw in the Ken Burns series is that they were basically saying that this dated to the Revolution, when actually it's probably several years later. But I could be wrong. It's worth tracking down. But in any case, it's conflict, basically brother against brother kind of conflict. Happened in the summer and into the winter of 1786, 1787. Keep in mind, August, August, September, these guys are harvesting their crops. And after the harvest is done and they try to sell it, they have some time on their hands. We have this image of the only image we have that I know of that shows Daniel Shays on the left and Colonel Job Shattuck on the right, both Revolutionary War veterans. And there's a bit of verse there. It says, through drifted snows let Shays the court assail, and Shattuck rise illustrious from the jail. In coward hands let legal powers expire, and give new subjects to my sounding lyre. Not great poetry, but basically it's saying that we've got Shay, who was being prosecuted. We have Shattuck, who was actually already imprisoned, leading a rebellion. The historian I mentioned, his research suggests that Shay led the forces against the Springfield Armory in Western Massachusetts. But he was not a principal in the rebellion. There were a whole bunch of other guys involved. It was very decentralized. And yet, to this day, back then and to this day, it's referred to as Shays Rebellion. And to me, that has interesting ramifications. Got this photograph that shows the house of Daniel Shays in Pelham, Massachusetts. I mean, look at it. This is not, a rich, powerful guy. And look at the land that he's on. It looks bad. It looks rocky. This is Western Massachusetts. It's not ideal for farming. And indeed, after the Revolution, a lot of these guys, particularly veterans, moved westward, where in New York State they found equally rocky, terrible ground to make farms on. Something I've never quite understood. So Shays Rebellion, it's Captain Daniel Shays. Again, he served in he's a veteran, fought at Lexington, Breeds Hill, otherwise known as Bunker Hill, and Saratoga, which was our first major victory. Well, we meaning Americans. At the time, my family weren't Americans. We didn't come here until early 20th century, so maybe we's the wrong word. He was wounded. He gets home and he was sued for debts, back rent, back taxes, whatever. And so the story has it that he organized 700 farmers, more or less, hundreds more eventually joining, um, marched on Springfield, where the federal government had an armory where they made firearms and presumably ammunition. They were defeated by the state militia in February 1787 by an overwhelming force of 4,000. Many were imprisoned. Shay did escape. Uh, he was later pardoned, but two leaders of that group of the, four or five prominent figures, two of them were hanged. But they did what became a typical tactic used throughout the 13 states. That is, they got a bunch of guys together and they closed in on a courthouse. They intimidated people until the courthouses were closed and foreclosure procedures were suspended. How long they thought they can get away with this, I don't know.
Jim, we do have a comment in the chat that
Mhm.
says, I actually heard that the rocky terrain in New England is a big reason as to why slavery never managed to entrench itself in the North like how it did in the South.
I think you could say that's true, but indirectly because the nature of the climate and the landforms, the varied landforms in New England, uh, led to general farming practices rather than production of what we call a staple, like tobacco, rice, cotton. So they were doing some dairy, raising livestock for meat to ship down to the West Indies, grains, they were making butter, they're doing all kinds of things. And that kind of generalized farming just is not well suited to slave gangs, where you have a whole bunch of people doing one task at one time for relatively long periods of time. So yeah, you could chalk that up to the lack of slavery developing in New England, although they had slaves, they weren't absent by any means, but they tend to be more domestic slaves and slaves working in the trades rather than agriculture. Anyway, this guy Charles Zug, published this piece back in 2021, and he goes through. He goes, Daniel Shays is hardly mentioned in any of the newspapers at the time or anybody's correspondence until he was, in fact, the leader of the raid on Springfield Armory. And all the documents suggest the rebellion was highly decentralized. There wasn't, local leaders led local groups. And so his argument is that Daniel Shays was used as a personification of the rebellion. He was sort of the scapegoat. He was the figurehead. And you see the word demagogue used in a lot of the newspapers and correspondence. He was a demagogue. He took these ignorant men, got them to follow him. And I mean, you could also say, yeah, certain of that may be true. Yeah, New England, that's hard to buy. This is a very literate population. It's founded by Christian pietist separatists. Um, they weren't that ignorant. They were very much involved in local government. So I don't think that argument washes anyway. But Zug's argument is that there were poor markets for produce, so these guys couldn't sell what they were making. They were subject to heavy taxes, had to pay in cash. Foreclosures were becoming very common. And so that's what got these guys ticked off, and they were taking action, the same sort of actions they took that resulted in our independence from Great Britain. And what these elites were doing in their correspondence and their published pieces in newspapers were the kind of, they're the ones who are being demagogues. It's sort of, oh, there's nothing to see here. It's just this demagogue here who's leading these people in revolt. And no, there were real issues that state governments were not addressing. So there's this quote from Thomas Jefferson, and I should say that during most of this time, Jefferson was an ambassador in Paris, in France, and so he wasn't witnessing these things firsthand. But this is a letter from him to William Smith, and he says, "What country before ever existed a century and a half, that is, from the early 1600s to the then present, without a rebellion? And what country can preserve its liberties if their rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance? Let them take arms. The remedy is to set them right as to facts, pardon and pacify them. What signify a few lives lost in a century or two? The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. This got to be the most, I don't know, I don't know what he was thinking. A very insensitive comment. It is its natural manure. Blood is the natural manure for democracy. Our convention has been too much impressed, that is the Constitutional Convention, by the insurrection of Massachusetts. And in the spur of the moment, they are setting up a kite to keep the hen yard in order. I hope in God this article will be rectified before the new Constitution is accepted. This is November 13th, 1787. That's my birthday. Um, and he's saying that, okay, they're through with the Constitution. Now it has to be ratified by the states. I don't think by November 13th any state had yet ratified it, but a couple would the following month. And he's saying that our convention has been too much impressed by the insurrection of Massachusetts. He's not there, he's not an eyewitness, but his impression is a lot of what came out of the Constitutional Convention was influenced by the insurrection in Massachusetts. At the same time, he seems to be blissfully unaware that these same sorts of things are going on in the other states. Um, Also, from this letter, the British ministry have so long hired their gazetteers, their publishers, newspaper publishers, to repeat and model into every form lies about our being in anarchy, that the world has at length believed them. The English nation has believed them. The ministers themselves have come to believe them. And what is more wonderful, we have believed them ourselves. That is, there's this in the newspapers, British newspapers, they're saying there's anarchy here in the 13 states. And uh, Jefferson is saying that's not true. That's just, PR stuff, propaganda. Yet where does this anarchy exist? Where did it ever exist except in the single instance of Massachusetts? Again, he seems to be a little clueless. And can history produce an instance of a rebellion so honorably conducted? I say nothing of its motives. They were founded in ignorance, not wickedness. God forbid we should ever be 20 years without such a rebellion. The people cannot be all and always well informed. The part which is wrong will be discontented in proportion to the importance of the facts they misconceive. If they remain quiet under such misconceptions, it is a lethargy, the forerunner of a death to the public liberty. This is a juicy quote. There's all kinds of stuff. You could spend in a university classroom, you could spend a whole class just on this one paragraph. But this idea that he's still repeating it, yet this demagoguery approach that it's based in ignorance, neglecting the fact that these folks are losing their farms, many of them after spending years fighting for independence. We get a letter from George Washington, who's quite incensed about this. Let prejudices, unreasonable jealousies, and local interest yield to reason and liberality. Let us look to our national character and to things beyond the present period. No morn ever dawned more favorable than ours did, and no day was ever more clouded than the present. Wisdom and good examples are necessary at this time to rescue the political machine from the impending storm. So this is in November 1786, where Shays Rebellion is just sort of starting up. And this is written to James Madison. And then finally, among my many quotes, General Henry Knox to George Washington, 1786. You may recall that Henry Knox is the general who managed the transference of captured artillery uh, from Ticonderoga to Boston that created that perimeter around Boston, laid siege, and forced the British to decamp and go to Nova Scotia. So from Knox, the people who are the insurgents have never paid any or but little, very little taxes. But they see the weakness of government. They feel at once their own poverty compared with the opulent and their own force, and they are determined to make use of the latter in order to remedy the former. Their creed is, quote, that the property of the United States has been protected from the confiscations of Britain by the joint exertions of all, and therefore ought to be the common property of all. And he that attempts opposition to this creed is an enemy to equity and justice and ought to be swept from off the face of the earth, end quote. So this is again, kill the sons of bitches. That's the attitude. And again, they feel it wants their own poverty compared with the opulent. It's not envy of the rich. They're losing their farms. They can't feed their families. So really kind of tone deaf from some of the major leaders of this country. Western Massachusetts was not the only place for such a riot. Camden, North Carolina had its own in the spring of 1785. Court of April pleas on their April session. They were hearing debtor cases, that is basically foreclosures. Rioters intimidated the jury on the second day of those hearings, and so they basically closed down the court. They couldn't get anybody to show up for a jury on the third day, so they couldn't make any judgments. So the judge suspended court until the fall session in November. The principal men in the county failed to support the judge who reports the incident to Governor William Tryon. So, yeah, the mob is doing this, and the wealthier, more powerful folks are keeping it at arm's length. We have another one in Exeter, New Hampshire, fall of 1785. So, we hadn't been in the Treaty of Paris is not 2 years in the past, and we're having these problems. Petitions from various town conventions. Again, New England is set up in towns. They're parts of counties, but local government happens at the township level, and their town is usually 30, 40 square miles, very different from what we have down here. But each of those town conventions, they're saying to the state, we want you to print paper money, and we can use that paper money to pay our debts. Of course, when you print paper money, the immediate result is inflation. And the face value of that paper money rapidly declines, often to a fraction of the face value. On September 20th, 200 armed men from Rockingham County. These folks you often see referred to in historical literature as regulators. There's a long history of regulators starting in North Carolina earlier in the century. But they march on the general court, which is the government. It's not judicial court, it's effectively the legislature. And they demand paper money. John Sullivan, Major General Sullivan, who was involved in the New York State campaigns, attacking and destroying Iroquois villages. Again, that was in Ken Burns' series. He called up militia of 2,000. They dispersed the crowd. Things sort of got back to normal. They pardoned most everybody, but they didn't correct the underlying issue, which was a severe economic recession and the inability to pay taxes and debts. Here in Maryland, everybody was so thrilled. The Treaty of Paris signed December, I think, no, sometime in the fall of 1783. The date escapes me for the moment. Tobacco was selling beautifully. Prices had doubled. The good prices on all sorts of exports as well as imports, domestic manufacturers. George Washington, and I'll talk about this in the next talk, among other things, buys into this company to create a canal that connects the Chesapeake with the Ohio Valley. Shares priced at £100 sterling, which of course hardly anybody could afford except for the very wealthy. But things were going great guns very briefly. Recession hits by 1785. Part of the problem again comes from the Treaty of Paris, Article 4. Creditors on either side shall meet with no lawful impediment to the recovery of the full value in sterling money, that is cash, of all bona fide debts heretofore contracted. So just because the war ended and there was a peace treaty, you were still responsible for whatever debts you had prior to the revolution. And of course, there's the issue of people renting land from Lord Baltimore. Did they have to pay those rents? In the end, they didn't. Were excluded from trade with the West Indies. What do I have here? 127 of 135 ships departing Baltimore in 1782 carried wheat, not tobacco. Once they're excluded from the West Indies trade, that's 127 shiploads of wheat that's not going anywhere. Overproduction of tobacco, again, because you can't ship wheat to the West Indies and Europeans aren't buying it. There's a contraction of credit. And then Henry Harford, again, the illegitimate son of the last Lord Baltimore, shows up demanding back rents. Uh, to refresh your memory, those of you who know a little bit about history of Maryland, Frederick Calvert was the sixth and last Baron of Baltimore. He didn't have any legitimate children, although he had a passel of illegitimate ones. I've got the head count somewhere in here. Um, but his son, upon his death, his son inherited basically his Maryland holdings. Frederick was kind of a waste product. He had several mistresses, although he was married. He was probably guilty of rape, but was acquitted. The court basically said the woman involved had, consented, but doesn't really look that way. And the whole thing was uh, published in a book, hiding the names of the guilty, by this woman, Sarah Watson, who was one of his lovers, consenting. Memoirs of the Seraglio, that is brothel or how do you call it, harem, of the Bashaw, which is a Turkish term, of Maryland by a discarded sultana. And so this really muddied his name a lot. Anyway, he died. His son, Henry Harford, um, comes to Maryland. He's once his father dies, he is the proprietor of Maryland uh, during the 5 years leading up to the Revolution. Came back in 1783 trying to collect back rents and the lands that the state government had confiscated, failing in all of that. So the state again was demanding tax and fees paid in cash, not paper money, but specie, gold, silver coin, as did the urban merchants. They wanted to be paid in cash. Um, we had a quarterly, this takes place in Port Tobacco. And if you're interested, there's a book by an historian named Gene Lee, uh, Jean Lee, published, I'm going to say, about 1998 or 1999, thereabouts. And it's about, Charles County. It's a history of Charles County. And she talks at length about this riot at the Port Tobacco Courthouse. At the time in 1786, Port Tobacco was the county seat for Charles County. Um, Only two of the justices showed up for court because of being intimidated by the crowds. The attorney, John Allen Thomas, representing a number of creditors, entered 100 cases of indebtedness. This is, well, here he's representing Alexander Hamilton, a Scots merchant, not the guy who became Secretary of Treasury and had a musical named after him. Uh, and, he's 100 cases from this one Scots merchant alone. And so this crowd gathers outside the courthouse. They intimidate Thomas, who's just an attorney, into dropping the suits. Thomas wasn't happy about that. Presumably, with the successful foreclosures, he'd get a piece of that action, as lawyers always do. So he demanded the governor do something about it. Uh, William Smallwood was not happy about this. He reprimanded the justices um, for not, basically calling in militia, whatever it would take to protect the litigants. Uh, and But that's suspended court cases for quite some time in Port Tobacco. Um, and the governor William Smallwood was from Charles County. So the justices, they decried, their inaction was decried across the state. You guys aren't doing your job. But what are they going to do? They're being, mobbed by a bunch of men, probably armed, at least some of them. The next court session did proceed without incident, but there were many foreclosures. These guys are losing their farms. Uh, I think Gene Lee pointed this out, is that the people of Maryland realized that the tactics they used to fight the British and ultimately to win independence weren't going to work in this new setting. They had to change tactics. Part of the problem is the leaders of the country, of what would become the country, were really concerned about mob action. That was the major point to make against a democracy, is you can't give power to the people because they will rule through mobs, and you can't run a country that way. Uh, the state, tried to do certain things. I won't go into the details, but basically, this is a depression existed across North America, and it wasn't anything any one state could do about it. But they realized, the people, the government of Maryland, as well as the governments of other states and the people of the other states, realized that the Articles of Confederation were not working. There were problems with trading across state boundaries, and each state imposing taxes and duties on exports, imports, and there was no common currency. It was a mess. Everybody realized that. They knew they had to do something about it. And just to sort of a case example of what happens at the individual level, because I've been talking about communities and forming what we called at the time mobs, but this had direct impacts on individuals apart from those, losing farms. And the case study here is a guy named Colonel Francis Ware, who served in the 1st Maryland Regiment. Uh, let's see, do I have a picture? We actually have a letter of his to Colonel John Dorsey. So we have an example of his handwriting. We don't have any pictures. Um, this is a case sort of kind of supporting a junior member of the force. But anyway, he ran for, back then as now, he ran for county sheriff. In Maryland, you run for the office of county sheriff. I think that's pretty common across the country, as opposed to chief of police. Ran in 1785, won, and ideally it would be a remunerative position. The job of the sheriff is to go around, make sure you collect taxes and any fees due from individuals that go to the state. And your pay is a percentage of what you collect. In order to do this, he had to post a surety for his performance. That is basically, here's this money of mine, and this is going to, this is my guarantee that I will do the job faithfully. The tax collector, Charles Mankin in Charles County, did the same thing. So they're responsible for collecting those taxes, fees, and fines. And if they don't, they're individually financially responsible. By 1787, Francis Ware owed 14,000 pounds to Maryland, with interest accruing at 10% per annum, which is kind of high. And it wasn't because of malfeasance. It wasn't because he was lazy or mismanagement or anything else. The people did not have the money to pay him. As a result, he lost all of his property. He forfeited his property. And he also had some friends who effectively co-signed the loan, if you will. They signed those sureties with him, and they too lost property. Uh, So all those goods, land, everything had to be sold to satisfy those debts. And apparently Francis Ware spent the better part of the rest of his life paying off what he owed his creditors, those who signed those sureties for him, as well as paying the state. So bankruptcy. Okay, getting into all this has to do with property rights. And I noticed from watching the whole of Ken Burns series, he talks a lot about property. And he takes sort of the position to a certain extent of historians in the early part of the 20th century, which saw a lot of the founding of our country and the creation of our government in certain ways as being about property, about money. And since then, historians have sort of fought back on that a little bit. But here we have James Madison, his comments in the constitutional debates. He talks about himself in the third person, but these are from his notes. James Madison differed from the member from Connecticut, he's referring to Roger Sherman, in thinking the objects mentioned to be all the principal ones that required a national government. Those were certainly important and necessary objects, but Madison combined with them the necessity of providing more effectually for the security of private rights and the steady dispensation of justice. Interference with these were evils which had, more perhaps than anything else, produced this convention. So this is James Madison in his notes on his speech to uh, the Constitutional Convention, that he's saying it's these riots, the interruption of justice, the lack of security of private rights of creditors that have led to a great extent to our being here in this convention in Philadelphia. So from the horse's mouth. And I just want to say a little bit about the growth of political parties. And this comes out of a book by a historian named Norman Reestjord, 1978. And he talks about Chesapeake politics, and particularly those from essentially the end of hostilities with Yorktown up to 1800. And he says, look, political parties existed in Great Britain long before the Revolution, so these are not new entities. And Americans were certainly familiar with political parties, but they thought, with their experience dealing with Parliament, they thought these were corrupt entities and not suitable for a democratic republic. Political parties appear absolutely nowhere in the United States Constitution. Our Constitution is not premised on there being political parties, although one of the earliest amendments to the Constitution, which we'll get to next month, uh, does sort of begin to recognize that there are political parties, but they weren't new. What Reesford does is that he's looking at Maryland and he looks at what goes on before the Revolution and up through towards the end of the 19th century as voting blocks. And that is a group of people who tend to representing the various counties in Maryland. They will tend to vote together on certain issues, but they're not political parties. They just have certain issues in common. So there are those in the counties where there are a lot of creditors. They're really interested in collecting debts. There are representatives from other counties where they're mostly debtors, and they're more interested in protecting the rights of debtors, avoiding foreclosure. And he defines parties for us. He says, parties have to require at least three things. They must have principles, certain principles they agree upon. And I don't know if he's still alive, but I'd be really interested in how he felt about our politics today, where principles are, if they're there, they're a lot less obvious than they used to be. They have to have constituencies. It can't be just a bunch of elite people coming together. They have to have greater support in the community. And they have to persist. They can't just come and go. And that's certainly true of parties in the United States. But he talks about these voting blocks as groups of legislators who have certain common interests and they tend to vote together. But they're not truly they're not truly political parties. And he actually comes up with a way of analyzing this. This happens mostly in our House of Delegates rather than the Senate, but in general happens in the General Assembly of Maryland, which is our legislative body. So we have voting blocks from really the Revolution, during the entirety of the Revolution, pretty much. You have those representing creditors who want taxes paid in cash money, not paper money. They want higher salaries for government employees. They're dead set against paper money. They support court reform to make it easier to collect debt, not to protect the debtors. They support the Continental Congress, and primarily from the Eastern Shore counties, Baltimore and Annapolis area. The debtor voting blocks want to be able to pay taxes and commodities. So you grow tobacco, you can pay your debts with tobacco. lower salaries for government employees, who they saw as a bunch of leeches, uh, demand that paper money be printed so we could use paper money, knowing that it would cause inflation. They were against any judicial reform that benefited creditors, but were probably okay with those that benefited debtors. They were very suspicious of the Continental Congresses, and this is really important when we talk about the Constitution. Not everybody's for this. Uh, uh, the Constitution that would grow out of the Continental Congress. And they're primarily from the Upper Bay and Upper Potomac counties, so tend to be the areas more outside the, uh, if you will, the more urban areas. In 1780, the Senate gets together. They, to meet wartime needs. This is the general in the General Assembly, the Senate chamber. They approved of the confiscations of Loyalist properties. That is, lands that belonged to Loyalists, including Lord Baltimore, were confiscated by the state of Maryland and then sold. They approved of paper money printing, and the debtors would deposit what they would get that paper money. They would deposit with the state treasurer, and it's sort of more rather than money, it's more like an IOU. And eventually they would have to basically buy that paper back uh, at a certain percentage and with a certain conversion rate from Maryland pounds to British pound sterling. The suspended debt prosecution, so the courts closed to British creditors, and that continued till January 1st, 1784. Remember, the Treaty of Paris is a couple months earlier. And part of that Treaty of Paris was those debts are now due. The war is not a reason for not paying. Uh, it did disallow interest payments by 1790 by a court decision. And that's because, okay, I couldn't pay the rent or couldn't pay these debts, but I couldn't. It's not like I could mail a check to the person I owe back in the UK. We were at war. So they really weren't responsible for interest on those payments. Most of those were paid off by the early 1790s and therefore not subject to arbitration, which was part of the Jay Treaty of 1794. And here's Reesford's statistics. Um, in 1782, the top table, you can see creditors, Eastern Shore, 11, only two delegates in those voting blocks. And you can see that for the five major regions of the state. And the totals at the bottom, you got 19 creditor, 19 debtor, 21 uncommitted. So they're kind of weak voting blocks. That changes just 2 years later, where the Eastern Shore is now heavy on creditor representation, whereas the Upper Bay, Cecil County, and the like, heavily in the debtor column. And so you look at the totals at the bottom, 26 delegates in voting, the creditor voting block, only 19 in the debtor, and far fewer uncommitted. So this is where we see the beginning. We've got these blocks of voters, delegates, and that is what eventually turns into political parties. So some final observations here, because I know we're probably running out of time. Um, we're barely out of the war and we're already in a significant economic crisis. To be fair, economic recessions, depressions often happen after significant wars because so much money is borrowed, so much money is put into producing things that don't produce capital. If you buy a tank, it's a tank. It has one purpose. It's not going to grow wheat. It's not going to manufacture anything. So it's kind of lost capital. And that's one of the things that leads to economic recession. There's a scarcity of cash money. Europeans are calling in debt and they want it paid in cash. And Great Britain froze us out of the West Indies and also off the pretty much the fishing grounds off Newfoundland. There's widespread unrest, and mostly that takes the form of intimidating courts and juries, just the way mobs would intimidate tax collectors in the years leading up to the American Revolution. Same methodology, but it didn't work. They forced courts to close, and a lot of them did, but only temporarily. They made these demands for printing paper money. A number of states did that, but of course that increases inflation. And so we get these decentralized groups, several in a particular state perhaps, fighting it out with the state militias that their taxes go to paying for. So not a good time. And out of all this, eventually we start developing political parties that by the time the 1790s roll around, start rearing their ugly heads. It becomes very evident. Anyway, that's all I have for tonight, and I'm happy to answer questions. With 2 minutes to spare. So, do we have any questions?
We think we have problems now.
Oh, I
We've
mean,
we've had problems for a long time.
yeah, but the problems then led to certain solutions that were pretty good solutions for the most part, but they've created their own set of problems to which we came up with solutions that also had their same set of problems. So, you know, I think, it's sort of an old saw about, well, democracy is something that people have to participate in. You always have to fight tyranny. You always have to do this. You always have to do that. You can't sit back and be complacent. If there's a lesson to American history, that's it. Complacency gets you into trouble. You always have to be watchful. Our founders were profoundly, they had a really terrible view of human nature. They assumed anybody given half a chance would be corrupt. They assumed that any leader given half a chance would become a tyrant. I mean, they tell us that. I mean, they write about it. It's not a secret. It's not something historians are, imposing on the past. This is our subjects are telling us this. And their answer to that was to be forever watchful, to be forever vigilant, and to engage in the political process.
All
There's a
right.
lesson of
Absolutely.
American history.
Absolute power corrupts, absolutely.
Yep, yep. That was their feeling, and that's why we developed the three branches of government. We often refer to them as co-equal. They're not co-equal; they are independent of one another. But the idea was that each of them would act to preserve their own interest, mind you, not out of some, you know,
It's not
moral
altruistic.
stance. Yeah, I mean, they're just to protect their own power base, they would ensure that each of the other two branches would adhere to the Constitution and remain in line. And it's a wonderful system as long as those three branches act in that way. Problem is, and something our founders or framers didn't consider is, well, they thought it was impossible. How would Congress not uphold its rights and powers? Impossible. Who knew?
All right, it is 8:01, so we are going to get wrapped up here. Thank you so much for joining us. If you're interested in coming to next month's presentation, it will be on December 15th, so a little earlier than normal. It's on the Constitutional Convention, and I put a link in the chat for that. All right, so thank you so much and have a great night.
And have a
Thank
happy
you.
Thanksgiving, everybody.
You too.
Same to you.